past and present. Those of you who've been here before may already know how Australia at Home's Zoom discussion works. First, they are interactive, but you're all muted for the moment. If you turn your screen to gallery mode on the top right corner and turn your cameras on, you'll get a sense of how many people have joined us for today's event. Second, if you open the chat box at the bottom of your screen, you can type to all of us. Introduce yourselves there and chat to each other about your own experiences, relevant books you'd recommend, or any questions you'd like our guests to answer. If we see a question or a comment that we like, then one of our organisers will message you asking if you'd like to ask it yourself on camera. So keep an eye on your direct messages as well. Finally, we're live streaming this and recording today for a video that will run on The Guardian, so please keep it nice. Our host, Michael Williams, would tell you that some of the most overused terms to describe books are eerily prescient and timely. Today, though, we're here to talk about a book that is both. Rick Morton's critically acclaimed memoir, 100 Years of Dirt, was a bracingly sharp examination of a life turned inside out, of family, violence, addiction, and poverty in Australia. After it came out, though, Morton found himself experiencing a different kind of insecurity. Receiving a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, the journalist and commentator had to learn to dismantle his own defences. He had to learn to talk openly about his experiences, to accept kindness, to seek help, and to find beauty and love. In his new book, My Year of Living Vulnerably, Morton traverses the road to healing. And we're so lucky to have him here today in this craziest of times to talk to Michael Williams, and I'll throw to them now.
Thank you, Steph, and hello everyone. It is a thrilling moment to see the moment in the Zoom chat where literally hundreds of faces suddenly appear, and many of you at deeply awkward angles. I've got an intimate relationship with so many of your nostrils, and I, for one, am grateful for that. I'm thrilled to have Rick here. That was a wonderful introduction from Steph. Hello, Rick Morton. How are you?
Michael, I'm well. Thank you so much for having me. I apologize in advance for my bookshelves, which I couldn't be bothered fixing before the event.
They seem perfectly fixed, and I'm always kind of inclined to quickly drill down and ask you questions about your feeling about individual books, but I'll resist and focus on the beautiful pink and orange book that is visible in the background there, the one that I can also hold up myself here in true game show host style. I am assuming, because this book is hot off the presses, its publication week is this week, that many of you are fans of Rick's but haven't had a chance to get to the latest book. If you're fans of 100 Years of Dirt, his extraordinary first memoir, you'll be pleased to know that Deb Morton makes an appearance from the very outset of this new book. Rick, I'm going to commit the cardinal sin of reading a fraction of you to you here. When I phoned my mum, Deb, to tell her I was writing a book about love, she was overcome immediately with wheezing laughter. What, you? She managed to ask, although the emphasis on you was long and made it sound like it had been shouted by a ghost on a passing skateboard. That is vintage Rick Morton, we already know, which is that combination of hilarious and acute and precise and a little bit self-deprecating and a little bit monstrous. The perfect combination, I think.
It's all I know, Michael.
This book partly springs out of the experience of writing and then promoting your first book. And I'm interested in that's kind of where I want to start. You strike me as a deeply self-aware human being who has spent a lot of time in therapy, a lot of time thinking about kind of your own relationship with the world. But something in 2019 shifted for you when you were promoting your first book, and it made you understand your own relationship with the world differently. What do you think that kind of inflection point was?
Well, it was a rabid bout of listening, actually, that did this to me, unfortunately. I mean, I was writing my memoir, 100 Years of Dirt, and it was all about trauma, right? And it was about my dad's trauma, my mum's, my brother's when he was burned and almost died. And to a point, my own having, I thought it was watching him that made me upset. And that was part of it. But I'd not come to terms with what had really happened to my brain. And I didn't think that the term trauma applied to me. And certainly no psychologist that I had ever seen, and I'd seen 7 of them, had ever mentioned it. And it wasn't until I was at a writers' festival, sadly not the one that you're curating, Michael, but it was Newcastle Writers' Festival. And I was listening to Dr. Mira Atkinson read from her book, Traumata. about what it felt like to have an episode of trauma in her adult life. And I remember just kind of thinking right there on stage, I'm like, oh my God, I need to go see a specialist. So, books are good. Books are really good at making you aware of the world around you, I think.
And also very good at breaking us open. So what a wonderful treat that is, that a book gives us. I've heard you say a couple of times, and it seems really fascinating to me, that while the writing of 100 Years of Dirt obviously unearthed some of that trauma, unearthed a lot of those kind of memories, almost harder for you than the writing of it was the reading of the audiobook. And I'm interested in that relationship between how your brain approaches these ideas and issues when you're in writer mode versus what it is to have to hear it back and almost approach it as a reader.
That's a really good question. And the writing, I don't find the writing easy from a practical point of view, but I find dealing with the emotions very easy when I'm writing, because it's almost like I'm a fish in water when I'm doing it. It's what I want to do. I have no fear response when I'm writing. Like I just write whatever is in my head. If it feels true and I've tested it and it's the truest thing I know, then I'll write it. And then when it comes to hearing things out loud, or if I'm reading the audiobook where I have to read my sentences back in the open, I'm just like, oh my God, did I do that? And more to the point, at a physiological level, I mean, it's just exhausting. Like it is just, you're stuck in a room for 4 hours a day. In the most recent case, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, for a week. And I was just completely broken by that experience. It was just, I can't find anything else in my life that compares to it. And like, Mum will tell you, I've got no calluses on my hand. I've never done a hard day's work in my life. Certainly not the kind of work that my family would say is hard. My brother's a carpenter, or he was. And, I feel guilty saying it, but it is the hardest thing I've ever done, is read the audiobooks for both these books.
I'm fascinated by what that suggests about the act of writing for you, and whether, if not a dissociative state, whether it gives you a lens through which to consider these kind of, at times, deeply challenging, deeply hurtful, deeply kind of terrifying things about your own life and your own experience, that, for lack of a more delicate way to put it, you can get in your journalistic head and kind of treat it as a subject rather than as something that you have to relive through the process of writing it.
It's funny. It's true. It's 100% true. I mean, there are multiple threads in my life that have led me to this state of being, I think. For those who read the first book, they will remember that my mum called me an alien when I was 4 years old, when I asked where I'd came from. And she used it as a way to explain what she saw as this weird, strange, slightly exceptional little boy. I was very strange, and I didn't speak English for 3 years. Like, no one understood me. I was very different and special, is the way that she put it. And so I grew up with this kind of backstory that I'd been put here by aliens and that I had to report back on humanity to explain the human race to my true alien parents. Now, that could have gone very horribly awry, but I just happened to be like, yeah, that sounds great. And it's led me to this kind of, there's that, but also much more fundamentally as a human being with this history of just horrible violence and trauma and stress and poverty. I never felt truly attached to the world. I always felt slightly on the outside. And I was better able to move through it when I was in observation mode. And it was like the way that photographers talk about taking pictures in war. If your eye is behind the lens, then you do have a distance. And writing is that for me. Writing is my way of both observing, but also processing what I have observed. And it's not always easy, but it's my natural state, and it's my most joyous state, I think, is when I'm writing something, because none of it's planned. Like, I don't know what I'm going to say before I sit down, and I find things out that I didn't know before once I put it on the page. And I'm being a little bit cheap. I'm using it as a form of therapy. It is a way to unjumble the mess that is my head.
One of the reasons I'm so kind of fascinated and by this idea with you is that I believe sincerely that one of the reasons you're one of the finest journalists working in this country at the moment is because you are so humane and so empathetic in what you write. And that I think anyone who's followed your journalism would know that there is not the faintest sense of a kind of a distanced kind of, you're perfectly dispassionate when you need to be, but the humanity of your subject matters is clearly what fuels you when you write. And so I'm interested that you're able to feel that empathy in your journalism and in your memoirs, while at the same time not have it touch you or kind of not make it impossible to go on.
It's tough. Like, I mean, that's really lovely what you said. I mean, I want to be upfront. Like, I have failed as a journalist many times, and I've done things that I'm not proud of. But it's not my instinct. My instinct has always been to just do the stuff that I get to do now full time. But obviously, there was a bit of a tension when I was at The Australian, for example, where requests would come from the editors, and sometimes I would fight to ameliorate them, and sometimes I wouldn't because I was worried about losing my job. Just terribly human, cowardly things sometimes. And so I think part of what I've been growing to understand as an adult, because I've been a journalist since I was 17 and 9 months, and I haven't always been like, I was an ambulance chaser when I was a cadet journalist and was deeply affected by it, but didn't know it at the time. Just chasing dead bodies basically every day. And as I've gotten older, and also as I've had the kind of ability to kind of sit back a little bit and test what it is I want to be as a person, and what I've learned about my own upbringing, like I didn't realize how much growing up the way I did, watching my mum struggle, had really affected the way I viewed the world until I came up against these gross caricatures of wealthy people in my writing, even in my newsroom, and even the well-meaning ones didn't really understand, or never could understand, and were kind of rude about poor people. And so it was a real slow burn, I guess, in terms of my very slow radicalization towards these things that I think I knew deep down, but had been scared to approach in any particular way. So in some ways, this book is me coming to terms with that very long road, because it hasn't always been perfect, but I do feel, wherever I've had the most me in the story, I've been able to do things where I do kind of view everything through the prism of my mother. Like, our story is not a universal story, but there are elements of it in almost everything that I've ever covered, particularly in social policy.
Your mother in your writing is such a powerful force, and Deb is so alive on the page when you write about her. She's extraordinary. Sorry to reduce her to a character, but she's an extraordinary character in your books. And the kind of defining force behind her and your relationship with her is love. So I'd just like to kind of pause to reflect on, as someone who's on the receiving end of that depth and wealth of love, what it felt like to start to process the idea of a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder as being a response to inadequate love elsewhere.
It's hard because, and I try to make this distinction in the book, at least I had mum, and my word, she tried to love enough. I say this in the first book, love enough for the failures of everyone else around her. And she did, and she's got so much love. She's like a little neutron star, but for love. Like, she's tiny. She's the size of a hobbit, and yet she's got more love in her than half the universe. And it's an astonishing feat of engineering more than anything else, I think. But she's also just a really curious, engaged person. What I love most about her, and I'll get to the other part of your question, but what I love most about her is that none of what we would ordinarily view as deficits in her life, as in the lack of money, the lack of education, the lack of social mobility, the lack of cultural access, none of it stopped her from being curious about the world. And ignorance is one thing, and no one can be blamed for ignorance necessarily. We start off that way when we're born. But if you have a lack of curiosity about the world, then I think that's the problem. And she's just always been the opposite. And so it was difficult for me to understand why this diagnosis that is defined by a deficiency of love should arise. And yet it makes perfect sense, because you always want what you didn't have. And in my case, I didn't have the love of my father. Now, it's like reading a bad review for a book, right? You might have all the praise in the world, but you see one bad comment and you go, well, why me? And in my case, it was, I had mum, but there was this evidentiary proof that there was a man who, everyone believes that your parents should love you unconditionally. And he was a man who couldn't, in both his actions and his words. And to me, that became the fault line in my life. It was like, no, I didn't believe anyone else if they told me they loved me, because why would they? Because my own dad couldn't. And so that was so powerful, I guess, in its destabilizing, that it even, undermined the foundations of my own mother's love. And in saying that, I'm lucky to have her, because there are people out there who don't have either from their parents. And that is, we see it written across our institutions in society, people who did it far tougher than me, because they have had no love, no stability, no security. And it's a sliding scale. So, mum was, she was stretched. She was trying to do it for all three kids and on her own while she was working. And there were moments when she failed, not as a parent, but as a human being. And I don't blame her for any of those, but it was a real rocky road for a while.
I'd like to remind all of you who are part of this conversation that it is a conversation. It's a book club. Because it happens in the middle of the day, you're less likely to be 3 glasses of wine in than you might be at another book club. But that shouldn't hold you back from sharing your own. Well, Rick's 3 glasses deep, but that's his choice. But we'd love you to be part of the conversation. So if you put your comments into the comments thing and your questions, we will come to you as and when we can. So, Rick, I think maybe the most useful thing, assuming that most of the people in this conversation haven't read the book yet, is to kind of drill into what that diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder meant for you, what it said to you about the way you were living your life, and the kind of quest you undertook off the back of it to make sense of it in the world.
It's correct. So thank you. We just discussed that it's a diagnosis. I mean, complex PTSD is like any other trauma, except its genesis is in the fact that someone who was a primary caregiver, a parent, a guardian, who should have loved you, either didn't, or they emotionally abused you, they neglected you, or you felt like they were absent. And it's defined not by a single event, but by accumulation of moments and a persistent kind of lack of love. And so when I got this diagnosis, I realized, and I'd kind of come to variations of this realization in little packets along the way before I was diagnosed in early 2019. But I realized that I had, for survival-based reasons, I had shrunk myself, and that I had reasoned deep in my subconscious already that love had hurt me. Being open to the world had hurt me and had diminished me. And I'd spent my 20s deliberately walled off. I was like the city of Troy, except I didn't accept any of the gift horses. So I was just, I was shut out from the world. And I made sure I stayed like that for a decade, because I knew deep down that if I opened myself up, then I would be wounded again. And for a while, you can get away with that. Like that can work for a bit. And I threw myself into my career. But I realized with this diagnosis that the opposite must be true in terms of the solution. So if there is a deficiency of love, then I need to give myself an injection, and I need to do it a lot and liberally and in all aspects and with the broadest possible definition of love, because I don't have a romantic partner and I never have. But I've got so many people in my life who I love. There are so many things about life that I knew I loved, but didn't allow myself to articulate, because I was trying to be small. And this book is an antidote to all of that. It is a way, it is a blueprint, it is a living document about the ways in which we should all try and be in the world. And, you know, it's the greatest question that all philosophers have tried to answer, which is, what does it mean to live a good life? And I'm not saying that I've solved the question of living. That would be a remarkable scoop. But I am saying that for me, I think I have found a collection of things, a kind of museum of artifacts and curiosities about life that have made my journey so far actually enjoyable, despite everything else. And this book does chart that, I think, like in different subject headings and themes and whatnot. So hopefully it does that for you too. But, you know, it's not a self-help book because I couldn't possibly make that false advertising. But it is a book that I hope helps a lot of selves.
Nice distinction. It certainly works for me on those terms and others. One of the things that struck me a couple of years ago with my own therapist, the thing that my therapist accused me of was narrativizing things, that I had a tendency to thread disconnected things together and turn them into whatever story suited my emotional state at the time. And I'm very impressed that the ways in which you narrativize things seem to give you coherence rather than hide from them. You're kind of radically honest about the way that you thread those things together.
It's a trap. It's a massive trap because, and I write about these experiments in this book, but, you know, there were a bunch of people in the 20th century who had their corpus callosum severed. So the highway that joins the left and right hemisphere of the brain to treat their epilepsy, which was otherwise incurable. So they just cut it in half. So the left couldn't talk to the right. Now, these have been over-analyzed, but the core facts remain that it's very technical, but I won't, so I won't bore you with the details, but essentially subjects in these experiments with the split brain were shown something through their left eye, which gets processed from memory in their right hemisphere. Now, the right hemisphere has some very good basic language skills, but all of the complex language is done in the left brain. So these subjects were shown a command written down on paper through only their left eye, and it says something like, go and get a glass of water. And the right brain processed that, but couldn't form it in any complex language. And so the people found themselves going to get a glass of water and they had no idea why. But when they were asked, the left brain, having decided that it needs a story to plug this gap, it was processed somewhere and it couldn't tell you why. They just said, oh, I felt like going to get a drink. They had no concept on the left-hand side of their brain that they had just been commanded to do it. So the brain is very good. We are very good at telling ourselves stories that seem convenient just because we have a desperate need to have a narrative. But at the same time, in trauma in particular, it's actually the fact that we lack a narrative that stops us from getting better in the first instance, particularly with kids or people who have poor language skills. If they've got cognitive deficits, deep down, their brain knows something bad happened and it acts out through the body. It literally takes control of the body and the mind, but you actually don't have access to it. The memories might be there in fragments, but you don't have access to the story. And that is the first step in doing something about it. So, but you do have to be careful. And I try to do this in my writing all the time. I'm not saying I'm always successful, but I try to test my own assumptions because there are things which might conveniently allow me absolution or generosity of kind of description in the way I go about things. But sometimes I'm just a bit of a failure. And sometimes the stories that make the most sense are the ones that are actually kind of embarrassing. I mean, ultimately, I am a kid with daddy issues. It's not fun to admit, but that is the truth.
I imagine your publishers sat you down several times and said, stop calling it your big nerd project and stop saying you're a kid with daddy issues. They might both be true, but they're not the best foot forward. Now, we have a question from Diane James. Diane, are you there?
Hello. Hi.
Hi, Diane.
I just saw the message, so I'm not quite sure which question. I've asked quite a few. I'm wondering what Rick thinks about the differences between the medicalisation of conditions in neurodiversity and also structural disassociation.
Look, I saw that in the chat, and it's quite interesting. So I was put on antidepressants in 2014, and to treat what I had been diagnosed with when I was at university much earlier, which was apparently depression and anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. Turns out now, I never needed to be on them, ever. And it's really annoying because they're terribly hard to get off. And so, what I needed at the time was a way to sleep when I was having these massive seismic kind of traumatic episodes that I didn't understand. But I realized in years hence that once I got the diagnosis, that the medications I'm on do nothing to address the underlying architecture and physiological differences in my brain that have eventuated because of what happened to me. And they also don't do anything to ameliorate the worst of the panic attacks. It's not an anxiety condition. It is a physiological response. So I've got some issues with that. I also know people who have been medicated and love it. And but I think we just need as much of the information up front as we can, which is why part of the reason I wrote this book was because I'm like, well, if I didn't know about trauma, having just written a book about it, then what hope does your average person have who's going to get, psychological support from a system that is tremendously underfunded and overworked? So I hope, does that answer your question? I don't know if it does.
I think that's an excellent answer. Thank you for that. And I should say that in the chat thread, there are lots of amazing accounts of people sharing their own experiences. And one of the things that I think you handle so sensitively in this book is recognition that telling your story and your relationship with this isn't a diagnosis for other people. It's not in any way prescriptive. It's more a kind of journey through some of the different aspects of it. I want to ask, it must have felt quite extraordinary to be underway on this process as COVID hit, when so many of those ideas about the ways in which we need other people, your chapter on touch, for example, several of the chapters in here, it must have felt like suddenly around you the world was kind of dramatizing those questions of distance and closeness, and rendering much more complex the nature of needing one another and expressing that need. How did that change the writing of the book?
I mean, quite apart from the fact that the pandemic is horrible, I found it really annoying because I'm like, hey, that's my script. And now suddenly everyone's talking about touch, and I'd never heard it talked about anywhere in the entire 34 years that I've been alive. And suddenly people are like, yeah, actually touch is really important. I'm like, no, I wrote a chapter about that. I mean, I'm joking, half joking. It was weird to suddenly find, I've got a chapter on loneliness, isolation, and, I went to Japan, I've got a chapter on touch and all these kind of, and beauty, and then masculinity, when a bunch of, misogynist men stormed the Capitol, misogynist and racist, I should say, stormed the Capitol building just as I'm doing the edits on this book. So I found myself, even though I really, really, really didn't want to even mention COVID in this book, because I didn't want it to be a book about the pandemic, I couldn't avoid it, because the pandemic is a disease, but really what it showed up more than anything else was the kind of fractures in the human condition and the ways in which our own weaknesses have been exposed, both institutionally but also personally. I just, for myself, I felt I actually joked before we went into lockdown that I was more qualified than anyone else to handle it. And I was wrong. I wasn't. I didn't even do a lockdown like Melbourne did, but because I lived with an ICU nurse, it was more strict than we otherwise probably would have been. And so I didn't see anyone else for 3 months. And I just froze. Like, I didn't write a single word of this book when I had all the time in the world. And it was really destabilizing, because I realized that having the choice taken away from me was actually the thing that mattered. And that's the distinction in my head between actual loneliness and solitude, is choice. And there are people who are desperately lonely, but they don't want to be that way. And I became one of those people in lockdown. So it was a real clarifying experience, I think. I mean, you could say that I was prescient or a bit of a clairvoyant, but, you know, if you write a book about love and the human condition, then at some point human affairs and events around the world will catch up, because that is basically what we experience every single day to one degree or another. So, you know, there are pockets of COVID mentioned through this book at my great resistance, but I do think it has elevated the concepts in all our minds over the last year. So in that sense, I'm hoping that the readers will be even more engaged than they otherwise might have been.
I've noticed, particularly at the start of this chat, but a few times you express that kind of equivocation or anxiety about whether the trauma you've experienced could be considered bad enough, traumatic enough, sit at the right place on the trauma spectrum to make it legitimate to have the experiences and responses to it that you've had. And I wonder whether writing about some of those these ideas against a backdrop of global pandemic does that it means that you suddenly, well, I don't have it as badly off as that person. I don't, my experience of trauma isn't as bad as other people's. My anxiety isn't as bad as other people's. How do you resist that? How do you make sure that you foreground and believe in the legitimacy of your own experience to be worth writing about?
It's important that you do, because so the thing that I had more anxiety about, which I think is more of a class / you know, cultural poverty thing, was the fact that I dared write about, you know, philosophical ideas or science or, you know, love, you know, these big, bold decisions or ideas that were never discussed in my house in those terms, like you might at a literary festival or at a university. I just never was that. I never felt like I belonged in that world. So that's what I was truly terrified about. I think we really need to guard against, as a society, this idea that we are in a competition for pain, because we're not. And everyone has something in their life that traumatizes them or hurts them or causes them discomfort. And yes, you know, there are some causes and things like that that deserve our priorities. And part of in the background of my mind, I didn't publicize this, but in the back of my mind, one of the reasons I thought writing this book was so important was because of the way, you know, my white family members, my, you know, white people in regional Queensland treated Aboriginal stories, First People stories. It was always along the lines of, why don't they just get over it? How come they're still going on about what happened 200 years ago? And to me, it's a fundamental lack or a deliberate lack of understanding about what trauma does. And so I obviously don't have that trauma, but I feel like the basis is very similar in all trauma, whether you've gone to war, whether you've been dispossessed, whether you've been failed by a parent. And, you know, I was talking to an expert at the start of this. He was saying, you know, complex PTSD sounds very nebulous, but the way it materializes in the body, its effects are almost exactly the same as for sexual assault survivors. So there's no need to get into a hierarchy, I think, with these things. In fact, I think it's more important than ever that we understand that the suffering is almost universally the same. And the more we understand that, and the more we understand the physiological response, the more we can have empathy and compassion for other people with whom we might not otherwise engage, like First Peoples, like sexual assault survivors if you've never been sexually assaulted, or people in the welfare system whose poverty is its own kind of trauma. In fact, you know, it's its own kind of trauma that shrinks the brain. And so all of these things, to me, it's like I've been given these goggles that allow me to see the world as it truly is. And I see trauma everywhere. It's not the same trauma, but it has the same underlying principles.
I think that's a really wonderful answer, and thank you for it. I kind of wish you'd been Scott Morrison's empathy consultant. That would have been useful for all of us.
I could do it for money.
Yeah, decent paycheck, or at least subbed in for Jen on some of the calls for advice. We have a question from Sarah. Sarah, if you could, because I think it encapsulates some of the definitional stuff that you've been touching on. Sarah, are you there?
I am. Hi. Yeah, thanks, Rick. I just think vulnerability is such a rich and diverse term that means so many different things to many people. And I'm really curious to know how you defined it for the context of the book and how it drove your year, essentially, please.
Thank you, Sarah. That was that's a really good question, because I didn't deliberately define it in the book, but in my mind, I equate vulnerability with love. Because I think love is the most vulnerable thing we do, whether it's romantic or otherwise. And the definition of love that I use in the book is from James Baldwin, who's one of the best writers that ever existed, I think, who says, I don't mean it in the shallow sense that Americans use love, but in the sense of personal quest and growth and daring. And to me, that encapsulates what I'm trying to get at with this book. It's this kind of constant project of attaining knowledge, of being curious, of being like a bowerbird for life's experiences, good and bad, because the opposite of vulnerability, I think, is that you are closed to those things. And I use the term at the end of the book. I'm not giving anything away. It's not a crime thriller. But at the end of the book, I talk about this concept of confusing the wind. So in architecture, when they build these amazingly tall buildings, like the Burj Dubai in Saudi Arabia, in Dubai, I should say, it's built to move with the wind by up to 2 meters, because in that situation, pure strength will shatter the structure. And I think that way about human life as well. Pure strength is not what we think it is. It is actually an invitation to demolition and to structural failure. So vulnerability is a way of confusing the wind. It's like moving with the elements. That's how I see it in my head anyway. But obviously there are many different ways that people relate to that concept.
I'm so glad you brought that up. If you hadn't, I would have. It's such a beautiful metaphor and really resonant. We have a question. I'm taking a little gamble here because she might not be ready or still listening. She might have gone for a cup of tea. But Eva Cox, if you're there.
I got it, Eva.
Fingers firmly crossed.
Eva, come back.
That's what happens when you mess with the system and you take a gamble. But I thought I would shoot it out into the world. When you talk, while we wait and see whether she's still with us.
I'm here.
Oh, hooray! Hello, Eva.
Hello, Eva.
It's time to get my photo back. I was sort of wandering through the other side faces, seeing who I knew.
Wonderful to see you. Your question in the comments was great, and I was wondering if you would mind asking it of Rick for us.
Yeah, I mean, I had a fairly dramatic first 3 years of childhood, running away from Hitler and dealing with all sorts of problems as a small refugee child. And I think it did affect me because I was away from my mother and various other things for long periods. And I actually ended up with my mother started reading me. We went from Austria to England. So, she was trying to give me English literature as a small child and was reading me Kipling's Just So stories. And I had a strong attachment to the idea of the cat that walked by itself. And I've always thought that it actually contributed to who I am and what I am, because I decided obviously at that fairly early age that I was not going to submit myself to things. I didn't go through the sorts of trauma things that you did, but it was obviously a fairly traumatic thing that made me push into that.
I think running away from Hitler counts.
Yeah, but I didn't have the thing. But what I also, at somewhere around the same stage, managed to acquire was a desire to fix the world, particularly after the kindergarten teacher refused to give me a drum because they only went to boys. And we could have the triangle and the tambourine, and I just decided I didn't make nearly enough noise, so it turned me into a feminist at a very early age. But I suppose I'm curious because I really enjoy your stuff, and I really enjoyed the stuff you were talking about, the socialization as a boy. I think that was a very relevant piece that I was reading. But I was curious about what made you decide to be a changer, because, to have that sort of desire to fix the world as well as deal with your own sort of traumas. Was there any particular thing that sort of triggered that off?
I'm glad you think of me that way, Eva, because I've never thought of myself as a changer. I come from regional Queensland. We don't do activism in regional Queensland, and it's a cultural memory that I'm trying to expunge, because I do want the world to get better, and I've never thought of writing or journalism as a way to do that necessarily. I've got great concrete examples from my journalism where I've helped individual people. And I love that moment purely from a sense of kind of self-worth. It's amazing to feel that. But systemically, I think, and I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but the moment for me that really turned things around in terms of becoming more of an advocate in my journalism, because I was taught not to be, was the GP co-payment debate when the Abbott hockey budget came in 2014. And I remember the people in the newsroom at the Australian, some of them well-meaning, some of them not, who were basically saying, it's $7, what could it possibly matter? And just dismissing the experience of people who lived in poverty, myself included, mostly through the eyes of my mother. And when I told them that $7 was a lot of money and that it can actually, in fact, be the difference between living in a home and living on the street, they essentially mocked that concept. And that, to me, was... I'm trying to think of the appropriate way of describing that. It was like the fuse was lit on my very slow radicalization. I didn't have a political education, so I didn't know that there were terms like Marxist or socialism. And in fact, to this day, I don't care for them, because the only thing I've ever really understood is practical effects on people. And if you try to use any of those fancy terms, on people like my mother, she'll tell you to get fucked. But if you say to her, I know what it's like to have to prioritize when you pay bills so you don't get the late fee, and do the sums every night in your notepad, then that is real. And so that kind of understanding that not everyone in the world understood that, based on, being cheek to jowl with them in an office in 2014-15, was the start of a very slow project, I think, of trying to be more active in the world.
Thank you for that, Eva. An excellent answer, Rick. I want to go to a question from Miriam. Eva touched upon your chapter on masculinity, which sadly is a chapter that will never not feel timely, it would appear. At this exact point in public life, it feels like it lands with a real kind of urgency and insight. Miriam, are you there?
I'm here. Hello.
Hello, Miriam.
Hi, Rick. I must say I'm so appreciative of all your revelations, because like everybody in this world, I've also suffered trauma, and the notion that one loving parent is not enough is very, very interesting, what you say. And also Eva's point about the war trauma, because I have a number of people of my generation who were refugees, and it has made them a certain type of person. And
yes,
my
and
question is,
on that. Yeah.
My question is basically about gender differences. I've looked at the comments and I noticed that they're overwhelmingly female in the chat line, which is very common. But I wondered how your books are received by men, basically, and what sort of responses you get from males, because this whole question of vulnerability is often something that is supposed to be what's missing in men to have really deep, intimate relationships.
That is such a fascinating question. And it's something I've only just recently turned my attention to. I mean, this is by the by, but I was looking at a graph of my Instagram followers this morning, and 75% of them are women, which obviously most of my male friends have more male followers than they do women. So it's my core audience, I guess, has always been, I joke about it, but it's true, it's mums. I love mums, and hopefully mums love me. But I have noticed the difference between the two, those two genders, male and female, not, obviously recognizing that there are other ways that people express themselves, but women will be public. They will be open, and they will be like, oh my God, I saw myself in this book. And they will thank me, and they will tweet it, they will Instagram it, they will get up at a writers' festival and say it. Men email, they private message, and they do it quietly, but the effect is no less real. Like, particularly with 100 Years of Dirt, I had, and this truly shocked me, but I had men from farmers, cattle station, like cattlemen, people who went to boarding school, who were in prison, but all of them were saying, I wish that I had the strength to be more open and to be vulnerable, because all of them to a T said things to the effect of, it has been a limit on me as a person to not be able to do those things. And that it truly stunned me, because I didn't think for a second that men in these areas or in these stereotypical lines of work would even read the book. Certainly, you know, maybe I come at it too poisoned, because like the men on my father's side of the family it's almost hard to overstate how much of a caricature they are of what we understand to be toxic masculinity or a broken masculinity. But it has informed my writing in this book, because I know from those emails I got about 100 Years of Dirt that there is a yearning from men to be open, and that there is a sadness when they don't fulfill it, particularly at the end of their life. And that's something that I'm trying to get at. And I don't know how better to do it than what I'm currently doing. I'm not saying that I've found the answers, but you know, we need to create both men and women, but particularly men, because we built this prison ourselves. We need to create an environment of permission to be like this and to redefine what strength is, because, you know, this is the strong stuff. This is how you be there for your family. If that's what you want to be, a provider, then you need to be there emotionally, not just financially.
Apologies, I just muted to cough so as not to give you all COVID. I'm going to go again, sorry.
I'll just keep talking while Michael has a coughing fit. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Seamless work. Look at us voguing. People may have seen the part of your chapter on masculinity that was excerpted in The Guardian, but you had that amazing stat from Beyond Blue about men aged 30 to 65. Was it a quarter of them have no one outside their immediate family on whom they can rely?
Might have even been 30%, but it was a significant number. And it goes in the opposite direction. So like women, as they grow older, they tend to have significant friends within whom they can confide outside of their immediate family. And most people take their immediate family as a given. So what you really want is people outside of that network. Men, on the other hand, lose everything but that, as a general rule, lose everything but that immediate family, and particularly their wife or spouse. And it's one of those, reading that research was very interesting to me, because it was a dynamic that increasingly frustrated the women in their lives, particularly their wife or spouse, because these men were withdrawing from the world and coming to rely more and more on their wife or spouse. And the men themselves became bitter toward their wife or spouse, because they'd found themselves, quote unquote, apparently with no prior cause in this situation. And it's incredibly sad. I mean, it's not always the case. Obviously, men are different, but there is a startling uniformity in the way that they fail to maintain friendships. The stat in that research shows that they derive more joy in their life from their male friends, but they are almost uniquely unqualified to keep them. And that's partly because they're afraid to say, hey, do you just want to hang out? Because apparently hanging out is somehow gay or feminine or weak. And it's something that I'm noticing that is changing with the younger generations. Certainly with my friends. I mean, most of my friends are women or straight men. And with my male friends, there is a real sense that we need to be together to get things from each other that aren't necessarily available anywhere else. But it's not a toxic thing. It's a love thing. And it's really beautiful. So, you know, hopefully things change very slowly.
On that question of support networks, we have a wonderful question from Francis Lee. Francis.
Oh,
Hey,
thank you. Thank you, Rick, for your compassion, your strength, your vulnerability, and your activism. Really appreciate it.
That's very nice.
So I am an immigrant Australian. I came over here because of the promise of progressive, liberal, Western culture and democracy.
I'm so sorry. Yeah.
And so I grew up on that diet of looking at white families in storybooks growing up, believing that, oh, you know, so white families have got it sorted when it comes to loving and hugging and touching.
Yeah.
The promised land. So I removed myself from my birth country to set up home here, only to find that homophobia and internalized shame and all of that still well and truly exists here in Australia, in our country. And so my question is, I wonder what is your view of growing and creating peer-run social support groups for gay men to come together in an emotionally safe space where we could help one another to grow out of loneliness, heterophobia, and the over-sexualized culture that appears to be the defining element of our community. And you mentioned how much you love hugs and touch. And I'm getting that sense that, you know, because, okay, I'm guilty using Grindr and others.
Oh, we've all been there, Michael. We've all been there. Yeah.
Dating apps and all that. You often see this refrain from other men that says no strings attached hookups. But I'm seeing that as the secondary emotion. I think the primary emotion is that we all want strings. We want strings with one another, but we don't know how to approach each other in a tender, vulnerable, relational way. I'm a student social worker, so I hope to get into this space to help other men like myself in the community to grow, but I don't really know how.
That's an amazing testimony, and kind of thank you for that perspective, because it's one I've struggled with, particularly because I was, you know, I had internalized a lot of those social structures. I mean, just broadly speaking, and I don't mean this as individuals, but my word, the English have a lot to answer for, not just in colonialism, but also the way they colonized shame and fear and regret in descendants from them, because they are, you know, it's that stiff upper lip thing that we have inherited so much in this country, and it's really dangerous and corrosive, I think. And to your broader point, I mean, some of my best friendships are platonic friendships with other gay men, particularly one that has struck up more recently. And we have been talking about this and how there is a kind of a version of that masculinity that we've taken into what should be a culture where we've broken down those things because we don't need them, right? But we still find it difficult to approach basic needs like touch and hugs and comfort and talking lovingly, rather than what sometimes emerges, which is a competition to be devastating and witty and tough. And, you know, there's this projection that a lot of gay men do, myself included, particularly when I was younger. And I'm trying to worm my way out of that. And a friend of mine, Kenny, suggested that we should form a support group for older gay men in particular who had done so much of the heavy lifting in society and never been rewarded for it, or at least, you know, didn't find themselves with the comfort that we have now grown up in to a relative degree thanks to their efforts. And it's not just gay men, but in our case, that's who we would be talking to because we've got more in common. But, you know, something, I mean, we need to get over that initial stumbling block, I think, which is like, it's okay to be around other gay men and not want sex. In fact, it's necessary. It's necessary to feel like we are valued as people. And I think we have taken on a lot of the assumptions from, you know, people who don't like us and who have historically hated us, and we brought that into our community. And I think that's a disease.
Thank you for that question, Francis. I think we've only got time for one more question, and I'd like to throw to Belinda Cooley. Belinda, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hey, Belinda.
I was really interested. I work as a child and adolescent mental health specialist, and I work with a lot of schools. And I was interested to know whether you thought school was a protective factor for you. And if it wasn't, what do you think schools can do better in supporting vulnerable students to remain in a school setting, which is often, you know, a place of safety and also, as we know, a great thing to get education?
Oh, God, good question. I think I'm outside the norm on this one because school was my favorite place, because I was so interested in learning, and it became a place where, because I found the right teachers at the right moments, they kind of, you know, when we launched the Voyager spacecraft, we used gravity of Saturn and Jupiter to slingshot it into space. And that's how I came to see those teachers in my life. They gave me a run up. But I realized I went to a regional state high school in Queensland. And for most of the kids there who were experiencing what I would now term as complex trauma and developmental trauma, for a whole host of different reasons, school was not that place for them. And I think it was partly because we don't understand or put effort into the way that trauma can manifest as an apparent disinterest, behavioral challenges, obviously, but also a general dismissiveness of intelligence by saying, well, clearly they're not interested or they're just dumb. And what you end up doing in those moments, and you know this, obviously, you don't need me to tell you this, but what we end up doing in those moments is reinforcing the fact that these people already think they have no value, and they've come to a place where they've found the proof. And I think that's the tragedy. And I mean, I don't know necessarily what the specific steps are to combat that. But we do need people in schools, good teachers, well-paid teachers. We need specialist support staff, teachers' aides. You know, my mum's a teacher's aide. And I remember her, you know, she had one kid who, his one goal, he was in year 5, his one goal, he was an Indigenous kid. And the one thing he put in his jar on his desk to start the school year, because they all had to have a goal, and his goal was, I want to learn how to read. And I mean, that's just devastating. And mum cared, and she became his favorite person at school. And then, of course, you know, as the way things often happen with kids from, you know, low SES backgrounds or from, you know, Indigenous backgrounds, regional backgrounds, his family upped and moved because they had to. And then, you know, he was upset again and he was somewhere different, and who knows where he is now. But those broader, what I would call social determinants of mental health, those are the things that really need to change. And that's a conversation we need to have with government, unfortunately, because I don't see, you know, you get lucky if you find someone on the ground who cares. And we need to rely on more than luck.
We are very lucky to have Rick Morton on the ground caring. I hope what we've managed to convey with the conversation today is what an extraordinary book My Year of Living Vulnerably is. It is a book about trauma, but it is overwhelmingly a book about love in its many different, many necessary forms. Hearing Rick describe the ways in which his mum is characterized by curiosity, it strikes me that the quality that it sounds like she has and that Rick definitely has isn't just curiosity, but it's generosity with it. It's applying your curiosity for the betterment of those around you. And it's what makes Rick an astonishing writer. You can catch him, I can't help myself, several times at Sydney Writers' Festival, including talking about this book, talking about class in Australia. He is there, but his sessions are booking out fast. So if you want more Rick, get the book and go and see him there. But a big thank you to Guardian Australia and to all of you for being part of today's conversation. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm just blown away that people attend at all to listen to me say something. And it's honestly such a privilege. I will never not be grateful for this ability to do stuff like this. I really genuinely love it. So thank you.
I guess I'll pick up from there now. Thank you so much, Rick Morton and Michael Williams, for what was an absolutely beautiful and insightful conversation. And I'm sure you'll all agree with me there, just from the comments in the chat. I've just posted a link to Rick's new book there. It's out through HarperCollins if you want to buy it. He will also, as Michael mentioned, be appearing at the Sydney Writers' Festival. So if you're up there, please check out the program. Thanks to everyone who came and participated in the chat and shared their stories and experiences and asked such great questions. So we do this every month. So stay tuned to The Guardian to find out who our guest will be next month. Australia at Home, who hosted us today, is sponsored by Essential Media, Principal Company, the Centre for Australian Progress, the Community Council of Australia, and Guardian Australia. Next Friday, they have a tech talk featuring Lizzie O'Shea, Guardian Australia's own Dan Stinton, and the Centre for Responsible Technology Director Peter Lewis in an interactive discussion on the big issues in technology, politics and society and what the future will be. So if you're interested, check it out. Thank you so much to all of you and have a really wonderful weekend.